please welcome Tom de Vleesschauwer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I have to correct you. I know the spell checker on many Microsoft systems is confused always with our company name, IHS. So I'm here to share with you and provide a little bit of context, I guess, to the presentations that will follow from the vehicle manufacturers as to how all of these solutions could help to shape the future for the mobility sector. Very briefly here, who is IHS? We are a major provider of information and data and insight to many capital-intensive industries, and I represent the automotive part for this. So I just want to start by outlining a little bit, putting it into a context. The world is changing, and a whole new mobility context is taking shape. And we have many different issues that are affecting the mobility issue. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go too detailed in all of these, but I just want to point out that the regulation pressure, the economic uncertainty and the economy itself are really sort of givens that we have to work with in the first place. The others I will point out more during my presentation now. And of course, society is a very important driver within all of this. But I'll start off with talking about energy, because it really sort of started off as being an energy-related event here, the summit here. And I just wanted to point out what we refer to as being the energy rivalry, because more and more alternative power sources are becoming viable. We've just heard a very interesting presentation from our Japanese colleague here about the hydrogen aspect. And why are we doing all of this? Well, we're really sort of looking at it from a point of view that if we're taking a very long-term perspective, up to 25 years out to 2040, what we can see is that in terms of the amount of oil demand, energy demand, effectively, that we expect will be required, you can find when we're looking forward up to 2040, that more than half of that actually is yet to be found or under appraisal. That might seem a little bit scary. I have to tell you that actually in reality, it's always that we have new oil fields under appraisal and under development. So we're not too worried that we're going to have a shortage out there in terms of oil. I guess the bigger question really is, does it really make sense that we continue to push for that extraction and development of oil sites? And can we continue to rely on the transportation dominance? As we've already heard about the hydrogen prospect. So let's take a step back and think about our mobility. And really what I want to point out about, it's all about the city and mobility. We've probably heard already earlier today that everybody will always need mobility of some sort. And it's not just about the city of today, it's about the city of tomorrow that we live in. And I'm referring back here to information from the United Nations, who have the most interesting statistics when it comes to vehicle population forecasts. And effectively what they're saying is that by 2050, 86% of the population will live in urban areas by 2050. Now I have to say this is for the developed countries only. If we would include all of the countries in here, it would be probably in the 70s. So still a very high percentage rate from where we are today. Today we're probably at about sort of like 58% of population living in urbanized areas. So more and more of us are going to move into urbanized areas. And that means that we'll have implications on the mobility, how we offer it, and is it suitable for us. But what I should also point out is that each city evolves in its own pace. No one city is the same as another. And just to give you an example in that, in terms of linking it back to mobility, let's have a quick look here at Rio de Janeiro. In 1993, Rio was really like an outstanding city in South America because they provided an underground or a metro network. Very rare in that time in South America. So they had 2 lines there, a very impressive public transit system in place overall. Now, if we forward the clock 20 years, 2013, you can see that Rio still very impressive achievement there. They've extended boat lines, and it's very expensive to extend a metro network like that. Part of this was obviously subsidized by having the investment made for the Football World Cup and the Olympics, pending for that. So it's a pretty interesting development there in terms of how Rio evolves in its own pace, which is pretty rapidly for South America. Let's compare that now to another emerging market, Shanghai. 1993, metro? Nope, we don't have it. No one really knows about it, uses it. We move the clock forward 20 years, 2013. I mean, this is an extreme case, but I mean, it's amazing, really, to have that kind of investment and the speed in which all of this was put into place. And even yet today, that metro network is barely able to cope with the capacity that they're having to deal with in Shanghai, and in Beijing, it's a similar situation. In the interest of time, I have a really great video about, like, in rush hour, the metro network in Beijing, and it's just chaos. But I'm not able to show it today here, but if you're interested, we can always give you a private viewing for it. But it's just giving you an idea, really, that each city develops in its own manner. And whatever solution we apply could be different depending on what city that we're in. And we're talking about this urban aspect, the motorization. We're having more and more people coming in there. Already here in Tel Aviv, we experience urban gridlock during the rush hours. I live in London. I have it almost on a daily basis. And in many of the cities around the world where I travel to, it seems to follow me along everywhere, this congestion. So it is really a global issue. Just as an illustration here, our previous speaker from Tokyo, you would probably feel at home there with a top picture actually taken in Tokyo, morning rush hour in Tokyo. And a more probably interesting one is the one underneath, the Beijing one. I actually took that myself while I was stuck in traffic in Beijing, but at least I was sitting comfortably in my vehicle because all those poor people, and it's a huge line, it didn't fit all in the one picture there, who are all waiting for a bus. It's going to be a long wait, and in Beijing it can get cold in winter, so that's not the most optimum conditions. It's just such a huge demand for urban mobility there. And what do we see about urban motorization? We're starting to get more of a realization as into the cost involved with that. Some researchers from OECD have given us a very interesting indicator there, that purely from an economic cost point of view, congestion, they're estimating, is about 1 to 2% of GDP of a country. That's a huge amount. So we're talking about hundreds of millions to billions of dollars each year, the cost of congestion. Now, in today's world, most governments haven't got a couple of spare hundreds of millions or billions lying around. That's a lot of money that we could use in a different way. And that's just purely the economic impact. We're not even talking here about the health cost related to the pollution aspect from this congestion. So it really is something to think about for the future. And really what we're saying is that ultimately, if we let it happen in its free reign, this kind of congestion, ultimately cities will sort of wither, really, and well, I wouldn't say die down, but people will start to give up on the city and potentially move away, because there comes a point where nothing moves anymore and we're completely fed up with it. So the big question is are we going to allow for congestion to reach its peak? Or are we going to put artificial limits, self-limits in place? And we already have a couple of examples in China and in Singapore and in other markets where indeed limits are being put into place. So really economic and environmental externalities, we think, will start to prevent cities from reaching its peak in many markets, and many more to come in the future. And a great example of this urbanization, and I like to think of a side effect when you look at a medicine or a pharmaceutical product, they usually have a lot of talks about side effects on there. I had interesting discussions last time I was in New York with some of the local councils there, and they were saying they were getting worried about the number of gas stations, that's fuel stations, in Manhattan. Manhattan is quite a prosperous place, very crowded, and about 10 years ago in Manhattan there were 60 fuel stations. Now today, there's only about 39, I believe it's going to be 38 by the end of this year, left. That's a significant decline. Why is that? Well, a lot of these gas stations are on very desirable plots. They're on corner plots, and many property developers in New York are very keen on buying up those places and making a lot of money with putting apartment blocks, condos in place there and selling them on. And if you know that a typical gas station operator in the US is not making any money from selling fuel, because it's too cheap out there, but they really only make money from selling lottery tickets and cigarettes. When they are offered a huge amount of money for their plot, many more of them are starting to pack up and sell off. So are we going to see a side effect of urbanization? Could be that we are going to promote electric vehicles in an urban mobility because our conventionally fueled vehicles are going to struggle to be able to fill up their car. It's just a role reversal, really. Well, let's look at it from another perspective. If you live in Manhattan, and probably let's assume in 20 years' time, you're going to have to always cross that bridge, go into Brooklyn or into Queens or other parts, just to be able to fill up your car. That's not a very pleasant experience, and it sort of brings you back to the idea like when I'm driving an EV, ooh, where is the next charging station? We're going to have that role reversal. So I think this is a very important aspect, and maybe Manhattan here is running ahead of the curve compared to everyone else. But let's talk about some of that societal behavior, really, because I think it's a very important, forceful future force. The public, the vox populi, sometimes they don't act as we wish them to, and I wonder why. But more and more power to the people nowadays, and it's all because of technology. I think probably everyone in this room here will have a smartphone, probably some of you will have too, and it's making us very powerful. And the best example really is that if we look at China. Once the American embassy in Beijing started publishing real-time air pollution data on their website, suddenly Chinese consumers say like, well, hang on, it's not a blue sky day today, like my government tells me, but it's actually a pretty bad day. I mean, it is visible that it's pretty bad. And more and more pressure was being piled upon the government there, up to the point where the Chinese Prime Minister has actually declared war on air pollution. So this is unheard of before in China for that to happen. So it's really power into the hands of the public and enabled by means of technology and having the smartphone, which is an extremely powerful device. The same smartphone is not just changing our aspects in terms of awareness for pollution, but it's also allowing us to book on demand a ride in a vehicle. We can share a vehicle, we can call a taxi, we can share a bus. There's so many different concepts out there. We can even, like one-click parking nowadays, like reserve a car parking space, like I can in London if I have the right app on my phone. So it really is that power back to the public by means of technology. Very important aspect. The next step, very critical also, is the Millennial Shift, as we call it. It's this new generation of young people who very soon will slowly start to take over the reins of our society. I can always say that they have very different preferences, lifestyles, and attitudes to what we are normally used to. Most of us have probably got a driving history, probably like 20, 30, 40 years. So it's normal that whenever we drive a new powered vehicle, be it a fuel cell or an electric vehicle or a plug-in vehicle, that we compare that to what we know. But these younger generation, they haven't got that luggage with them. I'm quite fortunate. I have two of these millennials at home. I can do a case study on a daily basis. And I can find out that particularly my daughter, her life revolves around a smartphone. And the minute that battery stops, her life's on hold. Next thing she needs is, where's a power plug? I need to charge this. Well, that's an important indicator to me about how they think about things. It's not just a smartphone. It's a tablet, it's a laptop, it's a hairdryer. All those things use electricity. And they all need to be plugged in quite fairly regularly. So to them, energy means electricity in their young life still. I think, we're sometimes forgetting that importance really of that aspect. So they really will start to bring change to that. And on top of that, we know that they love to share their whole lives online. The whole world can know what kind of pizza they ate yesterday or other part. So it's a natural for them to start sharing mobility and thinking about it from that perspective. So it really is a very different kind of behavior and pattern. And it will take time. but slowly it will get in there. And that's why I put a little picture up there on the top right-hand corner. That's a consumer of an electric vehicle tomorrow, and he is used, like, we can feeding him by the spoon, really. This is how you plug in an EV. Probably by the time he will grow up, or he or she, and be able to get a car, probably won't need a plug anymore, and it'll probably be wireless in the first place. Right, so it brings me on to the urbanization aspect. I think I already spent enough time on that overall. So really, we're having, within our environment, or mobility environment, it's being shaped by some very powerful forces, very powerful drivers. Now, we've already touched upon many of these, but I think the policy aspect is probably one that deserves a little bit more attention there. I think that's why it's so important why we're here today, all in terms of the summit here, because it really brings everybody together, and we had already some private discussions this morning with many of the local policy makers here from Tel Aviv, and I was quite encouraged to see that there is an interesting debate happening there, and an awareness that's rising also because of this. Because often it's very simple policy measures that can help us to enable many of those small features, unlock really the potential for some of these. It's not just having an app that will let you use Uber when Uber is potentially outlawed in many countries in Europe, and maybe even in more markets in the future. So there is clearly an understanding that needs to be built there. And potentially, we could almost argue that this new technology, which is very strong here in Israel, is moving at a pace so much faster than our regulatory and our policy process, and that we really need to find a balance between that and maybe reboot potentially both of them to again really get matched up in line with each other. But I think one of the most important aspects, really, the other ones I've already touched upon, is that importance of intermodal travel. There is no one single solution out there. I mean, we keep saying there's no magical bullet in terms of powertrain for our vehicles. It's the same in terms of future mobility. There is not a single one solution that works. We need to have a combination and many different alternatives that are provided to the consumer, to the man in the street or the woman in the street. And we probably have to use that innovation, that technology that we have to ultimately provide a seamless mode to provide that intermodality between our travel. And then truly only then will we probably move on to the next stage within there. So just sort of really to start wrapping it up probably, the future mobility, we can look at it in terms of it's a big puzzle, like a big jigsaw. And some of those pieces are starting to fall into place. I mean, the pieces that have fallen into place and arguably have been in place already for some time, we can't avoid the economic prosperity and the oil prices. They're always going to be part of it. The public transit system, it is a prerequisite for our future mobility, and the more different modes of public transit that we have and the smoother they operate will make it easier. And the VMT, with VMT I mean vehicle miles traveled. More and more of us are living in cities or urbanized areas, and as we see from the UN data, even more will be in the future. So the consequence will be that we're actually going to be driving less. So if we're driving less, we can ask a question, well, do we really still need then that personal vehicle? And we can choose between different modes. So it's a very important aspect from that also. But we can already see that trend happening today. But we have many other pieces that are starting to fall into place. And technology is one of those where you can argue, well, it's already there today and maybe not, so it's nearly falling into place. It's just sort of, not fully gelling yet with all the rest there. And then maybe to use the analogy of like we're in a kitchen here, we're baking a cake or we're making a pizza. We have some core elements in place here, but what we're missing today still is that magic sauce to bring it all together, really. And so technology is going to be a fundamental driver, as we heard already earlier. The cost of the battery, the lives of our young millennials revolves around it, is still quite high today, and the power density of it is probably still not up to the point where we need it to be. But there's a lot of work going on there, and it will happen. So it's sort of starting to fall into place. Car and ride sharing, it's already being used today. Again, we need to fine-tune the model a little bit more, find out what works, where does it work, how does it interact with other modes. So again, it's starting to fall into place. New urban mobility solutions. We've all seen pictures of the Google pod car. That's what I would like to refer to as a new urban mobility solution. It's something like a car, but it's not really a car. and motorcycles, any kind of new form of mobility that could be suitable for our urban environments. And then finally, the autonomous vehicle. I mean, it's ultimately still out there in the horizon. It will happen at some time, but really, the way that I like to say this is that, okay, the pieces are effectively all here. We know about them today. We still need to continue to working on them. But I do think that, and I'm convinced it will likely be sooner than we think, that this whole jigsaw will really fall into place. And I'm hoping that the next colleagues from the vehicle manufacturers who will be presenting after me will start to provide a little bit more view on that, and I'm sure they will, because they are actually working actively on some of those solutions. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much, and I think I'm spot on in time, so we can move on to the next paper.